Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about giving some examples of increasing range of motion on exercise variations in order to get more hypertrophy out of a movement. And something that people need to think about, we oftentimes point out that when we increase range of motion on an exercise, we oftentimes, not always, and I want to make that clear, that's not always true, but very frequently it is true that we increase the hypertrophy potential of that exercise. All right, so what does that mean for those of us who have access to different bars, different equipment, maybe just different grips, easy stuff we can do? Well, when we're dealing with exercises that actually do not have a full range of motion, such as something like in some cases the bench press, right? Because it can be limited by the size of your chest, it can be limited by other things. In some cases, though, some guys have a smaller chest, and it's possible for them to bench deep enough to actually hurt themselves because they're not thick enough. So what we need to remember is that the bench press itself, even though we think of it as an exercise where the terminal range of motion is when you touch your chest, and the other end is when your elbows lock at the top, right? But it, in and of itself, has a rather ambiguous range of motion relative to your joints. Right, and in many cases, increasing the range of motion on it with something as simple as a closer grip bench press may make it a better hypertrophy exercise. And I'm not even close to the first person I think who's ever said that on YouTube. I've definitely seen some experts out there point that out. And is it universal? Is it guaranteed it's going to be more growth? No. But when we start thinking in terms of stimulus to fatigue ratios, it may improve it a little bit. And you know, when you're trying to ride that bleeding edge and you're trying to get in as much training as you can recover from while stimulating as much growth as possible, little tweaks like that absolutely can matter. Plus it's, you know, overall easier on your shoulder joints. For some people, let's come back to that point. In most cases, there are people who it hurts their shoulder more depending upon their structure. Everyone is slightly different. We're not that different, but there is some differences from person to person, and just be aware of that. Same thing, we come over to the deadlift. Well, most people know that deficit deadlifts are a big favorite tool of a lot of powerlifters. It's when we stand on a plate, stand on mat, something else. Why? Because it makes the exercise harder. Makes the exercise harder. The deadlift is in and of itself, the conventional deadlift is a partial. Okay, there is almost no joint involved in it that goes through its full range of motion. Well, maybe other than the spinal erectors. But they're a different type of muscle. They have a very short range of motion anyways. They might get maximally recruited, but if you look at the hips, the knee joint, stuff like that, a lot of these other muscles are really only at like half contraction or half of their stretch. Things like the quads, things like the hamstrings, but definitely the quads. A lot of these muscles involved might only be going through half of their potential range of motion or 2/3 of their range of motion. Right? Lats only have a very small partial on it. So the deadlift is a partial for the most part for most of the muscles involved. And it's not to say they don't get stimulated. You can stimulate them pretty hard. But it's certainly not really taking full advantage of the stretch shortening cycle. And there's a difference between moving big weight and stimulating muscle growth. And I think we have to differentiate between that. Now, we know that the deadlift is a favorite among powerlifters. The deficit is. Why? Because not only does it make it harder, it makes it harder specifically by, number one, increasing the range of motion, and it increases the range of motion at the part where the exercise is most difficult. The deadlift is hardest off the floor. And when I say it's hardest off the floor, I don't mean that some people don't struggle with the lockout. What I mean is the actual force being generated by most of the muscles involved is higher. It's higher at the bottom than it is through the rest of the range of motion. From a biomechanical perspective, you have to do more work to get the weight started and to lock it out. And the guys oftentimes who fail to lock it out, it's like one muscle that's a weakness, or they use up so much of their strength breaking it off the floor that they don't have anything left to finish it. Okay, so that's why that happens sometimes. There's a couple of different things happening. But it makes it harder at the bottom, and it extends the range of motion through the bottom where there's the most tension on a lot of the muscles. Well, if you take a lot of the muscles that are at a partial joint angle and you extend the range of motion, that means that even more tension is put on them, right? What are we talking about? the quads, the hamstrings, all those muscles. The back gets put into a steeper angle. The erectors have to work harder. All of those muscles actually have to work harder to try to move the same amount of weight. And that's fine if we're maxing out, because we know that if we hit a max with any given weight on a deficit, like you guys saw me do a 575 there on the deficit, right, of a 2-inch. Well, my max is 615. So we know that if we get to a point to where we hit a PR off that deficit, if we ever reach our previous max on a deficit, we know we're going to be stronger on our normal lift. It's a good test because it's harder. But what about from a hypertrophy perspective, like when I'm doing these deficit speed pulls with bands? When we start doing volume instead of just a heavy 1-rep max, we start doing volume like this where we do a bunch of singles in a short period of time, or you start doing rep work, that deficit turns it into a better hypertrophy exercise, doesn't it? Number one, it works the muscles harder. A lot of the muscles that maybe we worried are not fully developed from the deadlift get more tension put on them. And we can do so with a lighter weight. And if we do so with a lighter weight, it puts less compressive stress and shear stress on our back, which means it's easier to recover from. So a deficit deadlift technically is easier to recover from and recruits slightly more muscle fibers. Well, when your goal is chasing hypertrophy instead of lifting the heaviest weight possible, that's an advantage. And even powerlifters, we all need it. We need to get thicker, right? We need to get thicker too. We need to build those muscles up involved with our lifts. They'll only make us better. You could do the same thing with a snatch grip deadlift. What does that mean? You bring your arms out wider, increases the range of motion just like the deficit does. Occasionally you'll get someone says, well, can't I do both? I'm like, well, why would you? You could just, if you have access to the way to do deficits, you could just stack the deficit at whatever height you want. There's no need for the snatch grip. Snatch grip might just be for someone who doesn't have a way to do deficits of whatever height they want to set it to. You have a lot more control with the deficits when you're trying to achieve the same goal. So just something to point out there. And you know, the same thing could be done with different bars. We could look at a lot of these exercises and say, okay, well, if doing this increases the range of motion, what about using this other bar? But what happens if I use a buffalo bar and I get a deeper stretch on my chest? Well, that's also helping, right? You're forced to use a slightly lighter weight and you're putting the pecs into a deeper stretch. What does that do for stimulus to fatigue ratios? That's phenomenal as long as it doesn't overstress your shoulder joint. Right? We could use specialty bars to do a lot of this. In fact, I love closed grip bench press with the buffalo bar. Okay, there's a lot we can do here. In fact, if you get to the point to where you do that with a buffalo bar, you're getting all the benefits of a dumbbell chest press. But not everyone has access to a buffalo bar. Not everyone has access to dumbbells. I'd say those two things are relatively interchangeable in terms of for high rep work, for hypertrophy purposes. Before someone jumps in and says, no, dumbbells balance you unilaterally. No, they don't. That's bullshit. That's a make-believe myth, not based on reality. People say, well, it works more stabilizers. What's the dynamic stabilizer? This works more. People love to say that word, don't they? They love to say stabilizers. Could you name the muscle? I'll give you the short name for it. It's called the bicep. There's your dynamic stabilizer that's works more. Ask you a question. Do you really think you're going to get really big biceps by doing dumbbell chest presses? I mean, if you're arguing that the dynamic stabilizers get more activation, therefore they're going to grow more, then that's all you need for biceps, right? Probably not. You probably need to do some curls and chin-ups and other stuff. Probably be a real good idea. I don't think you can rely on dynamic stabilizers as a form of hypertrophy. You should probably do exercises to build those stabilizers up. And throw that out there before anyone jumps in and says that. Because they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're talking about. But these are cases where we can manipulate range of motion on exercises that have rather arbitrary ranges of motion. Right? They're limited by structures, not joints. They're limited by structures, not joints. In the case of the deadlift, we're limited by the height of a standard plate. Well, we can manipulate that by bringing the floor closer up to our body, by stacking stuff under us. All right, closed grip bench press, we actually get a longer range of motion just by going closer. It's one reason, the ultra wide benching is such a big deal for powerlifting purposes. Because if you can do it without chewing your shoulders up, you move the bar a shorter distance, especially if you arch, right? But that close grip eliminates that, turns it into a better hypertrophy exercise. Because there's a point that we need to remember. There's a difference between building strength and demonstrating strength. We build strength by building muscle mass. We demonstrate strength by lifting maximum weights. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.